Thanks everybody. Thanks very much to the Caston Centre for hosting this. Certainly makes our job a lot easier and great to be part of what Caston does. Also thanks very much to Greg and Rosemary for coming along to help expand out on what I'm going to talk about. Greg, as you probably know, wrote the Extended Users Manual for the state of Victoria. The only book available to you if you want to understand what you're supposed to be doing if you're an MP. When I went to the library, the parliamentary library, and checked it out, it opened with an audible crack of the spine. But since then, I have to tell you, it's constantly being referred to in the chamber. In fact, if citations in Hansard were added to part of your academic citation total that I know you have to keep these days, you'd be very happy indeed. And Rosemary's going to be able to tell you a lot about this subject as well. Of course, we all have great admiration for the presiding, for the clerks and the way they sit there hawk-like guarding the chain of privilege and proper procedure. But never, of course, anticipating the will of the House. And in Victoria, at least in the last Parliament, where we had a situation where no one party controlled the upper house, Wayne Tunnicliffe's job became a lot more interesting than he'd probably seen in a while. Now, I'm under strict instructions from my legal team not to, at any stage, argue my case on the steps of Parliament or the Caston Centre or anywhere else for that matter. So you won't hear from me tonight my side of the argument or anything else. You'll have to go to some of our academic and more experienced practitioners to flesh out the issues involved, which will be argued though pretty soon, Tuesday morning actually, at 10 o'clock down at the Supreme Court. But I can tell you what the nature of the dispute's about. I can tell you a little bit more if there's human interest here in why I'm pursuing this matter the way I am. What this case is about from my perspective is the information that Parliament, standing in the shoes of the people in between elections, needs in order to hold the government to account. Because without information, our democratic system ceases to function. So in August last year, on my birthday actually, I moved a motion, unanimously supported by the upper house, that asked the government to table a copy of the independent consultant's report that they had commissioned into Mighty. The report was done by Deloitte, and the Treasurer sometime later responded by letter saying that Legislative Council did not have the power to demand the document, as it was prepared for the purpose of submission to Cabinet. And that became the nub of our dispute, which we've sometime later put before the courts. Since this is already about balance between the Executive and the Parliament, I think it's very appropriate that advice that my legal team have given me, that I don't seek to impinge into the constitutional territory of that third part of the separation of powers, the courts. I put my matter before the court and I will accept their judgment, and I won't seek to talk about what I think they should do outside the court. But as this audience would well understand, there's a huge public interest in Mighty. It's got a high impact on the travelling public. Parliament spent a large amount of its time considering issues relating to Mighty. I've sat on 2 parliamentary inquiries into Mighty. I still don't quite know what it was that went wrong there. Despite that, though, there's almost no relevant information out there about the current functioning of Mighty in the public domain. You hear a lot of complaints from people, but you don't know from public documents how well it might be performing. So Parliament, standing in the place of the public, is flying blind on this question. Of course, this isn't just about Mighty. This can be about smart meters, this can be about the desalination plans, secret deals to subsidise the Grand Prix or coal companies or whoever it might be. any information where the government's asserting that it's not appropriate for that to be put before the Parliament. Freedom of Information Act, which I've been a user of for 25 years, is of course descending into farce. It's worse every year. That's right there. The Auditor General finds that billions of dollars worth of the public's dollars have been put outside the reach of his scrutiny through public-private partnerships, where he can't actually follow the public dollar and the public interest all the way into how those enterprises are working. And in relation to this same mighty report, the government used a section of the Ombudsman's Act, which has never been used before, to deny him access also. So let me tell you what I think's at stake in all this. Without the power to probe, the government has little more to, the Parliament, I should say, has little more to do than nod yes or no to legislation. That's all Parliament was expected to do in the time of Henry VIII, or his court around him, his advisors. But it was those seemingly never-ending struggles of the centuries after that time, where they painstakingly sort of threw off monarchical rule and then became this Westminster model, the model that so many want to emulate. The Victorian Constitution provides our Parliament with the powers, privileges and immunities of the UK House of Commons as of 1855. That's not in dispute, you can read that in the Constitution. So out of interest, I went back and I read some of the debates in the House of Commons in 1855. And the burning issue of that time was in fact the war in the Crimea. It still ranks as one of the greatest military disasters of all time. How it became to be exposed, though, is quite fascinating. And it plays out right there in those records of the debates as you read, and from the actual words of those MPs. There were whistleblowers, doctors, nurses. A nurse might have known the name Florence Nightingale. She had statistical analysis of the preventable causes of death that were amongst those soldiers that was so stark that people couldn't really ignore it. There was a Times reporter who, by use of the telegraph, can provide almost daily real-time reports from the battlefront back to people in London. One MP in debate said that it couldn't have been better for the Russians if they had a spy in the British camp. Some have said that's the first and last time that a war's ever been properly, and honestly and openly reported. Some truly harrowing accounts that MPs brought forward under privilege. The soldiers with these horrific battlefield injuries being described as convalescents and sort of thrown into the holds of ships that then steamed off to try and find hospitals that were completely without any kind of facilities, not even water to give to the wounded, as they constantly craved water lying there. Much of the misery was sheeped back to an arcane and unaccountable bureaucracy who held many of the resources that these soldiers needed to survive out there in the snow 7 miles away on ships in the harbour, but would hand them over without the proper signatures on the proper forms. So into this Parliament stepped the radical MP for Sheffield. He was a Liberal, but he had radical ideology. And in fact, he was my ancestor, John Barber's local member in Sheffield. Although John, being an artisan, he was a knife maker in the Sheffield Steel, he didn't get the vote until 1867 with the second sort of Reform Act. And this MP moved for a select committee into the disaster in the Crimea. The government treated the vote to establish that select committee as a motion of no confidence. And when it was clear that it was going to pass, they resigned as the government. So if the Parliament even needs to look at this question, then you have no confidence in us, we're out of here. So standards of accountability have obviously been lowered since then. And And mighty is not the Crimea, obviously. But there have been some projects recently that were about as well thought through as the charge of the Light Brigade. There's a good reason why no Parliament, as I'm hoping our speakers are going to tell you, no Parliament of Westminster Heritage has ever conceded its privileges to the executive government. Why no court has been willing to rule in the same way. The right to withhold access to any document, person or thing, as we say in shorthand. Because Parliament has the responsibility to scrutinise and criticise the government of the day, and of course to fully inform itself, the necessity to fully inform itself before it votes on any matter before them. These powers were hard fought over for many centuries. They're the foundation stones of our democracy. They provide us with the peace and prosperity we enjoy and value so greatly here in Victoria today. And I'm not going to give them up easily. Perhaps because there's some kind of historical thread that's come back and connected me to my guys back there in Sheffield, who all my ancestors didn't even move off really a few square miles through the entire period of the Industrial Revolution, and many of the votes, many of the changes that were made, of course, that we now take for granted as pretty much the basics of our system, were fought out in a very bloody way, and so we shouldn't be giving them up too easily. That's my personal motivation for taking this matter in the way I am. Obviously, it's not a cheap thing to do. You might well notice the little slip there. There are some people in this audience who've already very generously actually supported my case. And right now I can't think of a better cause. Whatever your issue or your passion, you must agree that to solve that, we have to solve the democratic crisis and bring all the activities of the government out into the daylight. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Yes, thank you, Greg. And my acknowledgement tonight goes to you for coming out on such an unpleasant night to listen to us talk about what is admittedly a very important issue. I noticed in the audience a number of Her Majesty's Council and Senior Council and retired politicians, various other dignitaries, and on the other hand I also noticed some friends of mine and also some students and some ex-students of mine, all of whom of course are very welcome. Makes my task slightly more difficult though, because I'm talking to a mixed audience rather than the audience of undergraduates I often talk to. I have the pleasure of talking to people with a variety of levels of knowledge in this area. And perhaps in the name of all of us also, I'd like to thank the organisers of the evening who have laboured, I think most of the afternoon, and of course beforehand as well, to get it ready. I want to talk about three things tonight. First of all, the supremacy of Parliament. Secondly, the strict law that's applicable in this area. And thirdly, how it is that we can stop, or how it is that we can avoid both extremes in this area. So first of all, the supremacy of Parliament. Greg's got it, the other Greg's got it pretty much right, and I can abbreviate what I was going to say on that point. We are used nowadays to thinking of the executive as the supreme power in the land, and various media outlets conspire to reinforce that perception. So that, for example, it's become a commonplace to hear on television or radio that the government is going to legislate. And every time I hear that, a little voice pops up in the back of my head and says, well, actually, no. The government's going to propose legislation. And I really do wish that I were armed with some sort of power to go around and issue on-the-spot fines to people who use that phrase. Because, of course, it only reinforces this terrible perception that the supreme power in the land is the executive, headed of course by the Prime Minister or the Premier. And perhaps there's a case study here for the sociologist or somebody about how it is that human nature tends to focus on one supreme person rather than a collective. Anyway, I'm not learned in that field, so I better pass on from it rapidly. Of course, the supreme power of the land is not the executive. The supreme power of the land is the Parliament. And that is why the government has to propose legislation to Parliament, and sometimes Parliament refuses to accept it. Parliament, moreover, consists, as I'm sure most people here are aware, of two houses. And both of those, and the Crown, and both of those houses together and the Crown make up the Supreme Parliament. And this reality is very well illustrated by what's going on at federal level now, in that the government is in power, the federal government is in power only by dint of the fact that it has the support of a number of Greens and Independents in the lower house. So we must always remember that it is not the executive that's the supreme power in the land, it's not the executive that's directly elected. It is the Parliament that's directly elected, and it's the supreme power in the land. And as Greg quite rightly said, it is Parliament that stands in the shoes of the people to ensure that what the government does is kept visible to the people in whose name it does it. So that's the basic principle of our constitutional system, that Parliament is supreme. Now, this reality, as I mentioned, has been rather covered up. Why has it been covered up? What's the difference between now and the 1850s when the Crimean War was raging? The difference, of course, is political parties, which arose in the last decade of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century, and have become a sort of cuckoo in the nest, and have meant that Parliament has been captured by what were meant to be merely opinion-forming mechanisms within it. Political parties, of course, have a number of advantages. If you look at the list of premiers in any 19th century Australian colony, you will see that they came and went with alarming rapidity because there were no political parties. So political parties are not by any means an evil, but nor are they an unmixed blessing. They have captured Parliament, and Parliament, as a result, has been not mortally wounded, but it has been crippled for the best part of the last 100 years. Fortunately, however, not all of Parliament has been captured. We do, in this state, thanks to some reforms in the about 10 years ago, and at federal level, in the Senate, we do have another House of Parliament, which is, because of the method of its election, specifically suitable, particularly suitable for carrying out the job of keeping the government under review. The way our system's developed is more or less that we have a lower house that tells you who the government is, and we have another house which is in there in that immortal phrase, to keep the bastards honest. And that's why it is that this litigation proceeds from the upper house rather than the lower. So that's what I want to say about the supremacy of Parliament. The next topic I mentioned that I'd look at is the strict law applicable in this case. And the strict law is, as was mentioned by Greg, that the Parliament in this state, or to be more precise, either House of Parliament has the powers of the House of Commons as they existed in 1855, when the Victorian Constitution came into force. That's, on its face, a rather odd way of defining the powers of Parliament, but an attempt was proposed to codify them in the 1850s when the Constitution was written, but that job was found too time-consuming and or too hard, and so they took the easy way out and said, well, look, we just have the same powers as the House of Commons had in 1855. And it's quite clear that those powers include the power to require the production of any document or person for examination by the Parliament. And that's part of what it means to be a Parliament. I remember reading, I forget who it was now, I remember reading somewhere or other that before the Victorian Parliament was created, Victoria had a legislature. Even a one-person governor can be a legislature in the sense that he is the person who legislates. But Parliament is more than a legislature. A Parliament doesn't just pass legislation, it is also the grand inquest of the nation, to use the classic phrase, or in this case, of the state, and it has the right not merely to legislate, but also to inquire into anything within the state of Victoria that takes its fancy. Because somebody has to have the final power to ensure that everything that might be amiss is subjected to examination. And the Victorian Parliament has that power. We've seen it exercising that power in a large number of cases. Most recently, for example, a select committee has been set up to look at claims of child sex abuse in the church, or one of the churches. I'm not sure exactly what the terms of reference were. So that's another field in which Parliament has said, well, here's something that's possibly amiss in the state of Victoria. We are the people who can investigate it. And in aid of that power, the Victorian Parliament, each house of the Victorian Parliament, has the right to call for any documents that it may wish to see, including the mighty document that we are talking about tonight. So that's the background, I suppose. My third point, though, was that we can't allow this power to become an extreme power. I have to differ slightly with in saying that there is a legitimate claim for some operations of the government to be conducted in secret. You cannot have, in my view, and with all due respect to Jemima Can and Julian Assange and everybody else, you cannot have a government that is completely open to the public. There is a legitimate scope for the government to be able to discuss its options behind closed doors without anyone ever knowing what it's doing. And for various secrets to be kept, most obviously at federal level, of course, we can't publish the secret intelligence that's obtained by the government, its diplomatic handbook, and so on and so forth. So it is not the case that everything that the government does should be published. But I've just been telling you that the Victorian Parliament has the right to call for any document that it wishes to see. And so there's an obvious contradiction here between what I've just said and what I said just now. I'm aware of it, of course, I hope. So how do I solve this? Well, we have essentially two possible extremes. The first extreme is that Parliament can call for any document it likes, no matter how secret it might be, and publish it to the world. The other extreme, which is more or less the case that the government is putting forward at the moment, is that it is the government that has the right to determine which documents Parliament should be allowed to see. Admittedly, there are some principles which guide the government in that determination, such as cabinet, commercial in confidence, so on and so forth, legal professional privilege and so on. But in the end, all that has to happen is for the government to stand up and say, in our opinion, this is a cabinet document, and that's the end of the matter. That is the other extreme. So on one hand, we've got a complete power in Parliament. On the other hand, we have the government's apparent complete power to refuse access to anything on its own judgment. And my case to you is that neither of those, in fact, is right. The strict law is that Parliament can indeed call for any documents that it wishes to see. But in the interests of operating the Constitution in a sensible manner, it should, when calling for documents, practice self-restraint, and it should also appoint, as the Legislative Council proposes to do, it should also appoint an independent arbiter, a retired judge or a Queen's Counsel, to determine whether or not a claim by the government to secrecy for a document for some reason is a legitimate claim or not. There's no legal requirement in the Legislative Council to do that, but it would be a wise and prudent thing to do. Of course, you could operate any provision of the Constitution in a way that would destroy democratic accountable government. That certainly can be done, not just with this provision of the Constitution, but with any provision of the Constitution. So we can't say as a result, well, power doesn't exist because it might be abused. Any power might be abused. But what we can say is that the government should submit its claims not to the opposition members of Parliament, but to some independent arbiter who will determine whether or not those claims are legitimate claims or not. And in that way, effect can be given both to the legitimate aims of the government in keeping its documents secret where they have legitimate claim to doing so, and also to the legitimate claims of the Victorian public through the Parliament that they elect to have such documents, to have documents that should be published to the world. So what should happen in this case is that this mighty document should be given to a independent arbiter who would be able to look at it and tell us whether or not it really does deserve the protection that the government is claiming for. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me at the Customs Centre tonight. And may I reiterate the acknowledgements and thanks of everybody who has spoken before me. One of the interesting things about the powers of a legislature is that their effect is inversely proportional to their use. What do I mean by that? It's often the threat of the invocation of the power rather than the actual invocation of the power that has effect in the long run. There are really only two powers that a legislature has. One of them is the power of inquiry, and the other power is the power to punish contempts. So in other words, if there's a lack of cooperation with your inquiry, there is a power to follow up with various means. I think what I would like to do this evening happily segues with both Gregs, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of Senate practice in this area. And there's been a lot of negotiation, there's been a lot of self-restraint, there's been the occasional use of a third-party arbiter. But in the end, I have to agree with the conclusions of both Gregs in that Parliament, as chief organ of representative and responsible government, should certainly take the supreme place in our polity. Now, orders for production of documents, which are at the centre of this case, represent one aspect of that inquiry power. The power to order documents is centuries old. It's still expressed in the same way. You can look at 17th century House of Commons journals and see that committees are set up and they're given the power to send for persons, papers and records. Very much what we say today. And if we're talking about history, look, there's a 1667 Select Committee inquiry into the miscarriages of the naval war with the Dutch, which is a doozy. Every piece of intelligence that passed amongst the naval commanders, every command, every failure to take action was inquired into by this Select Committee. 1667, recommended reading for the parliamentary tragics. Well, getting back to the Senate, since I'm a parliamentary tragic, the power to order documents was something that was used absolutely routinely in the House of Commons and from 1901 in the Senate. From 1901, for the first decade and a half, this was an extremely common thing for people from all parties to instigate. There were 29 of them in 1901, to give you an example. And many of them were for what would now be considered pretty routine information. There was a lot of statistical returns done. There was lots of information sought about defence measures, which of course was one of the new Commonwealth powers. There was a lot of information sought about infrastructure projects, the beginning of nation building. a lot of information about post and telegraph service, the NBN of the day. And all of this was routinely tabled. And over the early years of the Commonwealth, with these parliamentary requests and demands for information, it came to be reasonably common practice that a lot of this information began to be tabled routinely without the request being made in the first place. So you had things like government yearbooks and gazettes and reports that were routinely tabled in Parliament. And there were some politically sensitive matters, and the system managed to deal with these quite well. But then between 1914 and into the middle years of the century, the power virtually fell into, or the use of the power virtually fell into abeyance. There were a few abuses, and one that stands out perhaps is a 1943 order in which there was an order for details of all travel allowance payments made to Commonwealth public servants. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Remember, in those days there was a lot of toing and froing between Melbourne and Canberra, and there was concern about expenditure on the travel of public servants. 1951, there was another one, which was an order for the advice given to the Governor-General by the government in advance of the 1951 double dissolution to be tabled. Oh, couldn't possibly release that. Well, in fact, that wasn't the response of the day, because the advice that was given to the Governor-General in respect of the 1914 double dissolution had been sought and tabled, admittedly after the election when there was a change of government. But the government of the day in the early 1950s said, well, yes, you know, the Parliament has a right to this information, and we'll provide it eventually, once the sensitivities of disclosing advice to this particular Governor-General have been undertaken. So lo and behold, some years later, the advice was tabled. And as I say, sporadic use, but some use over those years. Then in 1960, a government backbench senator decided to initiate an order for production of some information about a local infrastructure project in Tasmania, where he came from. Government backbencher. Because in those days, government backbenchers did do things like this. And in those days, the Senate had the time to debate these matters as well. So a debate ensued, and not surprisingly, the leader of the government in the Senate took a fairly dim view of the whole arrangement. But he tried to argue that the power had actually fallen into abeyance, and that this was really an obsolete practice that shouldn't be revived. And then he said, well, what about the work that this will cause departments? It gets more and more familiar, doesn't it? And let me just read you a little bit more of what he said. He said, there would be considerable difficulty and embarrassment in returning to the old procedure. And as a result, disclosing not only for the information of the Senate, but publicly, and for the newspapers, and for all who may care to read, advice that from time to time is tendered to a minister and either rejected or accepted by him in the ebb and flow of the conduct of government. So it's interesting to note in that argument that there's an implicit, an acceptance of the right of the Senate to ask for these things. And in this, on this occasion, the government leader persuaded the majority of the Senate that no, it wasn't a good idea to invoke this obsolete procedure. That same implicit assumption about right to information, though, was there again when we come to 1967 and the infamous VIP planes affair. Those of us who are old enough to remember may recall that there was quite a scandal about suspicions that the VIP flight was being used inappropriately, possibly by family members of entitlement holders, and possibly not for matters connected with affairs of state. There were months and months of questioning about this, and a level of controversy in the press as well. And the Prime Minister of the day had indicated to Parliament that, although no records of the passengers on VIP planes are kept. Right. This was followed up by a formal order for production of documents in the Senate by the then opposition Senate leader. And the Cabinet of the day considered this Senate order and thought, oh no, we have to resist it. But the Senate leader of the day, government leader John Gordon, when he found out that not only were there passenger records, but there were complete and detailed passenger manifests and flight authorisation books, he felt that he had no alternative but to table them in the Senate. Now, of course, the political cost was that it demonstrated that the Prime Minister of the day had been telling his truth. And perhaps as with Watergate some years later, the biggest damage was done by the attempt to cover it up rather than by the initial behaviour, which was certainly that family members did make use of regular use of VIP flights, including flights without the entitlement holder being present. But what was interesting about this particular episode was that it marked the emergence of orders for production of documents as a powerful tool for oppositions. Because until then it had been such a routine thing, and it had also had quite a long tradition in the UK in particular of use by ministers to actually produce information to Parliament by means of what is still called unopposed returns. So it was seen as a benign means of putting information on the public record as an essential tool of responsible government, because parliaments can't survive without information. But then cracks start appearing in the system, I guess in the 1970s. These things always happen with scandals. And in 1974 we had the Overseas Loans Affair, the Kenrani Affair, where the government of the day went outside the normal parliamentary approval of loan raising into the private sector, into some murky areas perhaps. And as a consequence, the Senate eventually ordered a group of public servants to appear at the bar of the Senate and a private citizen to answer questions about the arrangements. Now, all the public servants were directed by their ministers to claim Crown privilege, what we would now call public interest immunity. And letters to this effect were sent by the ministers concerned to the President of the Senate and tabled in advance of the proposed hearings. And the letters indicated that the public servants had been directed to claim Crown privilege and directed not to answer questions. Well, this itself raised some very interesting issues because to attempt to interfere with a witness before a Senate or a committee is one of those classic contempts which can be followed up and potentially punished. So the direction to the public servants to not to answer questions was actually raised as a matter of privilege, referred to the Privileges Committee, which in the heat of the day produced the only totally fractured report in its entire history. But interestingly, there was no question of those public servants not turning up to the bar and taking the oath consigned. I know things were a little different here before the last election, but at that time there was absolutely no question that the public servants would not obey the Senate order. And in fact, one of the junior legal officers at the time who subsequently died, in his obituary a couple of years ago, it was revealed that on the day he had actually put a toothbrush into his suit pocket in case he ended up that night in Golden Jail. So seriously did he take the threat of invocation of parliamentary powers. At this time, the Senate passed a declaratory resolution affirming that it had those powers that we've heard of, inherited from the House of Commons, and declaring also that while there were certainly proper and appropriate claims that could be entertained not to produce the information, it was for the Senate to determine those claims. Now you can imagine how that went down. But the idea was that subject to any determination on the appropriateness of a claim for public interest immunity, it was the obligation of any person to answer questions and produce the information that they were requested to do or required to do. And from this point, I guess the Senate has developed procedures that tacitly acknowledge the right of governments to make claims of public interest immunity. And there are procedures to do this. They tend to be used or adhered to by the government of the day when it suits them. And in other occasions we have governments asserting that no, it's their right to determine these claims, to say what will or won't be produced to the Senate. The ongoing contest, I won't trouble you with the ongoing contest because it's recorded faithfully in chapters 18 and 19 of Odger's Australian Senate Practice, the 13th edition of which has recently been published, and which last Tuesday went up on the net as an e-book, so you can download it onto your iPads and mobile phones, but it's very large for mobile phones, and it's all searchable and all very, very smart. So you can read the sagas there. But really the upshot of these things is that the solutions are invariably political solutions. Courts have rarely been seen as a solution to the problem. And that is why I think the parliamentary world is watching with great interest Greg's case and awaiting the outcome with some degree of trepidation, but optimism. I guess the closest that the Senate came to getting anywhere near a court was from the other direction in relation to the Children Overboard inquiry. But the committee had decided to sort of pull back from the brink on two fronts. The first one was that they decided that they wouldn't summon ministerial advisors, although they had received and accepted advice from the then clerk about the lack of any known limitation, legal limitation on the Senate's powers and the lack of any recognised immunity for ministerial advisors. They decided, probably out of pragmatism, not to push the envelope on that occasion, because the pragmatic mind tells you that what goes around comes around. Oppositions become governments, governments go into opposition. The other point on which the committee held back was in relation to the former Minister for Defence, Peter Reid, and the committee decided that it wouldn't attempt to summon Mr Reid. It rejected advice from the Clerk of the House, which argued that some sort of immunity attached to a former member, but this was not accepted. And the committee's grounds for taking that decision was it thought that if it issued a summons, everything would end up in court, it would cost the taxpayer squillions, and in the meantime the committee couldn't go on with its business. So pragmatic decisions were taken. And the last example I want to give is probably the low point in executive parliamentary relations. And curiously today I heard that one of the directors of the Australian Wheat Board received his penalty today. And this goes back to the oil for food scandal involving the Australian Wheat Board. The government at the time had a majority in the Senate and declared at the beginning of estimate hearings that officers would not answer questions about any aspects of the Australian Wheat Board or oil for food affair while it was all before the Coal Royal Commission. There was no claim of public interest immunity. It wasn't a question of putting up a case not to provide this information. It was a question of numbers, and the government of the day had them and felt safe in standing up to the Senate on this occasion. But, you could never predict what's going to happen, and it came to fall apart at the seams almost instantly because the question was raised, well, what about statutory officers? Officers of statutory bodies, they're not subject to ministerial direction. They don't employ public servants in many cases. So we all dived into the statute books and checked out the arrangements for the array of statutory bodies that were involved in this area. And it so happened that one of them, the Wheat Export Authority, had unfortunately, given the previous round of estimates hearings, misleading evidence, false evidence. So they, again, facing a possible contempt inquiry, they had no option but to come clean, correct the evidence, answer further questions about the affair, as did many other officers from other statutory authorities. So it's one of those cases where you can't predict what necessarily may happen. And the same minister who made this declaration later acknowledged that majorities can be determined and that overreaching by governments can be seen to go badly in the electorate. Just as the Keneally government's prorogation of the New South Wales Parliament before the last New South Wales election, in order to bring a halt to a controversial inquiry into sale of state electricity assets, also went down very badly. Governments lose elections, not solely because of these things, but they contribute to a perception of executive power overreaching. So I think that that there is no solution to this eternal tension between the two, and our system encourages that tension, and that's part of the way that checks and balances operate by not having any one arm of power in the state dominate the others. But there are certainly some things that help. Certainly a popularly elected legislature carries enormous legitimacy, but in the end it can come down to things like numbers, it can come down to things like electoral systems, the size of Parliament. If parliaments are too small to carry both the executive arm and the parliamentary work, then there's strains there. And in the end, I think we need to remember that the parliaments both make and nominate governments. Thank you very much.
For questions. This question may have just been answered in the last discussion, but I guess just to make clear, this issue of public interest immunity, or this issue of Greg Taylor's second and third issues, on the one hand, the complete power for whatever it wishes, versus the government's ability to say no. Obviously, we've got a case starting in this state, or on Tuesday. But are there really no legal precedents, or actually court precedents on this issue, or have people always apparently pulled back from it?
Yes, it's on. Well, there have been a few precedents, not very many. The most recent one is in New South Wales. A case called Egan and Willis, which was different for a number of reasons. The most important reason is that the Houses of Parliament in New South Wales do not have the same powers as the Houses of Parliament in Victoria. For some reason, the Houses of Parliament in New South Wales never had conferred upon them the powers of the House of Commons in 1855. They have to rely on a lesser set of powers. And it was held in Egan and Willis that nevertheless the powers of the Houses of Parliament of New South Wales were quite extensive, but they did not extend to cabinet documents. That, however, is not a precedent in Victoria for the reason I've just given, namely that the Victorian Parliament's powers are much broader. And I think it would have greatly surprised the House of Commons in 1855 to hear that the Cabinet could not be required to produce documents that the Parliament required, particularly when you think that the powers of the House of Commons in 1855 were not materially different from the powers of the House of Commons in 1667, when there was no Cabinet. So I think that the conferral of power on the Victorian Parliament in the terms in which it is conferred makes a difference. Otherwise, of course, it would be superfluous that we don't need to have it. And it includes, therefore, requiring cabinet documents to be produced. There is no personal body in Victoria who is not amenable to that power in the strict law.
Okay.
Rosemary.
Just as a footnote to that, can I add that the New South Wales Legislative Council, following that clarification of powers in Egan and Willis, has the most successful and effective regime for the production of documents of any parliament in the country.
Okay, we have a question here.
Yes, just some questions without notice. But my understanding is you cannot make an FOI request to the monarch either for anything. And does that situation apply in Australia? Can you make an FOI request to the governor or Governor General? And secondly, doesn't the reserve powers in the Constitution really give the governor or Governor General supreme power if they really want it? They can rule on alone or without Parliament if they really think they need to do it.
Can I answer that one?
I think the question is, unless the question is actually directed to a particular person, I suppose, you can ask it as a panel can answer, or one can answer as well.
Right, okay, well, as far as the first question is concerned, FOI powers, I have to confess I'm not entirely sure of the answer. I believe the answer runs something along these lines, that the private correspondence of the household cannot be revealed, but the public records, such as the records of the official secretary, are amenable to FOI requests, subject, of course, to the usual exceptions for FOI. Unless anyone knows different, there might be some people here who know better than I do on that point.
You have to be an agency subject to FOIs.
Yes.
So that's what would mean that the monarch wouldn't be an agency.
You have to be an agency, but the opposite, the official secretary, I think, is an agency.
Yes,
Is an agency. So yes, that would be amenable in terms of the official records that it holds, subject to the usual exception. I might add on that point, seeing as FOI has been raised, that it's quite clear that cabinet documents as a rule can't be requested under FOI legislation. That, of course, is no precedent for Parliament, because Parliament is not restricted to mere FOI powers, which are available for something. So that's a slightly different question. And your second question was about the personal rule of the Crown. I'm pleased to be able to tell you that that's probably, or certainly not possible. There are a number of things the Crown can't do. It can't legislate it, and it can't raise taxes without parliamentary authority. And of course, without taxes, the workings of government quickly grind to a halt. So yes, I don't think we have to worry about that. There are certain powers that the Crown can exercise. For example, it can dissolve Parliament. In almost all cases, it does not do so, except in accordance with the conventions that apply to that. So yes, I think if anyone here is nine-worrying about personal rule by the Crown, I think I can be an effective sleeping.
Okay, there's a question in the middle there.
Is the Egan case a relevant precedent in Barber v. the state? And then secondly, how do the courts tend to see these disputes at the moment? Where is the pendulum, do you think, swinging, as Rosemary outlined in her précis of Senate practice?
Well, yes, it is a relevant precedent. I mean, precedents are divided, I suppose, into various types. One of them is the precedent you have to follow, right? And that obviously gives you no choice at all. Egan and Willis is not a precedent like that, for a number of reasons. First of all, because the state of the law is different in New South Wales, as I've just mentioned. Secondly, because that case was not, or most of that case at least, was not decided by a court in Victoria, or a court with authority over the courts of Victoria. So it is not the type of precedent you have to follow. It is, however, a case that obviously can be read for whatever useful hints and tips it may contain, to express it in a fairly non-legal fashion. And in particular, on your second query there, I think the court in Egan and Willis was indeed very concerned to ensure that parliamentary supervision of the executive was given the greatest rein possible. So I can't obviously predict what will happen in the court here, but if they have the same spirit as animated the court of Egan and Willis, then I am pleased.
I'd only add that in the case of Long in the ABC, the High Court gives a fairly interesting description of how it sees responsible government working. That includes very emphatically the power to order documents. Parliaments must have information in order to perform their functions of holding governments to account. It's almost a given.
Yeah.
Just a little. You can see me sitting here very quietly, as I said I would be. Of course, this was an advertising, you see, to get everybody going, and it's clear that they do want to know more about this, what I've been calling boring but important subject. You can go and find my application for the court on my website, and you can get the government's response, and you can get our response to their response as well. Because there's huge numbers of cases being cited there, but it's the courts that will determine which are the important ones and the relevant ones. You can certainly make a subject out of this. But the speaking outside that, talking about things not relating to this particular document, but in this general topic, I mean, I don't think Greg and My's dispute over the extent of powers in any way relates to this particular document.
No.
By class or content. Okay, this is a matter of other thing. But just speaking as a constitutionalist, well, we do need, it's clear from all our constitutions that we need an executive. And within the executive, there is something by convention called cabinet. Cabinet needs to front up to the sovereign with a clear view on behalf of the government, and so you want to protect that. But having ensured you've protected that, you certainly wouldn't want to be protecting the Parliament or the people from information, would you?
Oh, no.
So information is very important, which I think is coming from what Rosemary just said about the Long case.
Okay, we've got two questions, so Glenn first.
Was there anything other than political will that prevents, say, Parliament itself or the upper house, the President or usher of the black rod, or someone actually taking this case rather than you, Mr. Barber?
Someone had taken it to court, and maybe one of the issues that's talked about, so I won't talk about it anymore during the proceeding.
Yes, in order to, yes, standing, that's exactly right. Well, in order to take the case to court, you need something that's known as standing. That is to say, you have to show that you are a person, putting it fairly loosely, you are a person who's personally affected by the question. And it's not just a mere emotional or intellectual concern. The argument for Mr. Barber here is that he has standing because he is a member of the House which is being denied access to this information. It will be a bit harder for the clerk or the usher of the black rod. Do they have that in the Victorian?
Yes.
Yes, they do. Thank you. To bring that. In other cases, clerks or ushers and other administrative type people. Sorry. Yes, indeed. Clerks and ushers have brought cases like that in the past, but often for something different. So, for example, they want to know, can they carry out their ministerial function of presenting a piece of legislation to the Crown for assent? Because they're the person who's got to do it. That's their task. In this case, the clerk and the usher have no particular role in this. It is the member of Parliament who is the person who wants access and should have access, unless the government has some pretty good reason why.
Okay.
Sorry, my question was actually exactly that one, so I'm going to continue it with the question that what actually gives Greg not the stand if the argument is that the Parliament should have decided and the Parliament should be bringing this. I have difficulty with Greg bringing it. Well, in fact, I like Greg bringing it, and I hope it succeeds. But if Greg can bring it, then somebody who elected Greg should also be able to bring it. And I've really come down to the question of that if Greg has locus standi, then somebody who elects him should have locus standi on behalf of Parliament. And that would have been useful in the situation in England over the Iraq War, where in fact there was a major question of the legality of that war and the powers of Parliament.
Yes, I suppose it's falls to me again, but like to die. I'm afraid I don't quite agree with the statement you made. If a member of Parliament has standing, then so also does any person who elected a member of Parliament. That's not quite how the courts have tended to see these types of things, on the grounds that the member of Parliament has a particular interest in it because he's the member of Parliament. Whereas somebody with the right to vote may or may not have voted, I suppose, for that member of Parliament, and doesn't hold any particular standing in the law. I suppose that would go back to some centuries when being a member of Parliament was a particular honour and carried privileges and so on and so forth, and was considered to elevate you above the ordinary ruck of humanity. So I'm not sure it follows that just because a member of Parliament has standing, so also does any elector.
There's a question way over the other side.
Hi. Sorry. It's my belief that Julian Assange actually he stands up for personal privacy and open governments, but he actually allows for governments to have certain secrets. He does accept that they will have certain secrets. I guess my question is, this good old Sir Humphrey Appleby said the Official Secrets Act, it's not for protecting secrets, it's for protecting officials. And I know that this particular argument isn't about the Official Secrets Act, but it would strike me that the Mikey affair is more about protecting certain politicians than actually protecting an infrastructure project and the delving into that infrastructure project itself. So my question is, I suppose that it's people bringing this, it's people who are protected by this act and potentially will be brought into disrepute by information coming forward. I don't know what the question is. I guess my question is, how is it possible that we're in a situation where something as simple as, or not necessarily simple as Mikey, an infrastructure project, can be withheld from the people?
Well, it's certainly very curious for a number of reasons. First of all, Mikey is an achievement that was brought to us largely by the previous Labour government, not by the current government. So the extent to which they need to defend it is at least limited. Secondly, it is very odd that the Liberal Party in the upper house originally voted for this document to be released, and then when the evil day dawns, when it actually has to be released, a letter appears that says, well, actually, no, we no longer wish to release it. That is very strange. Why is this? I don't know. My best guess is that within the councils of the government, somebody said, well, hang on, we can't do this because it will mean that next time we'll have to do it, and the time after that, and the time after that, so we better take a stand now, even though there's nothing particularly in this document. I don't know. I don't know for two reasons. First of all, because I'm not privy to what goes on in the councils of the government, of course, and secondly, because we don't actually know what's in the document. That's the problem. I mean, in a way, Greg and I perhaps might differ on whether this document should be published, but neither of us actually knows, because we haven't seen it.
How do you ask questions without information?
Yes, indeed. So that's why we need an independent arbiter who will look at these documents in confidence.
But then who appoints the arbiter?
Well, the arbiter should be...
appoints the arbiter.
No.
The decision is going to go.
The arbiter should be appointed by the upper house. In New South Wales, where the system has been adopted, even though their law, as I say, is different from ours in one respect, the arbiter appointed was Sir Lawrence Street. a former Chief Justice of New South Wales. So the person appointed as arbiter should be somebody who commands the confidence of pretty much everybody. That is more or less why this case is being brought in the first place before the Supreme Court of Victoria, because the hope is that the Supreme Court of Victoria will declare what the law is. That won't actually force anybody to do anything, but it will have a great moral pressure. And it would be a terrible thing, of course, for the government to disobey a ruling of the court. Similarly, the hope is that you would be able to find somebody as the independent arbiter whose moral authority and judgment would be unquestionable. Anyone like to add anything to that? I do seem to be dominating.
Great job.
Well, I say it's far from being Julian Assange, it's not funny. But I'm just using the existing systems that are in place. I can speculate wildly about things that don't relate to my court case, and of course, I never want to be federal in peace. I can talk about official secrets without any worries at all. But things that have come up as we've talked here, we talked about legal advice to the Governor General, or if you like, the Sovereign. I was surprised to hear that that had been handed over, because some people might argue, and back hundreds of years ago would have argued that was the sort of correspondence of the Queen. You couldn't possibly go and have a look at that. A lawyer who gave an opinion to the Legislative Council said that legal advice should never be available to the Parliament. That's what you expect from a bunch of lawyers. They defend their own privileges, of course. But on the other hand, it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, could a government function if every time it had to take a piece of legal advice and then go to court, that legal advice, client privilege, if you like, was to be exposed? So it is interesting to sort of speculate about some of the classes of documents that it would be wise to expose. It comes back to my original point. We've got a constitution here. As I said, I'm not Julian Assange, I'm just a guy working through the instruction manual. Constitution Act 1975, when all else fails, read the instructions. And then I'm sitting there with my copy of Greg Taylor's Constitution of Victoria in my sort of sweaty palm while I'm about to get up and speak and vote. There might be things that would as Greg said, pushed to such an extreme would actually mean the Constitution didn't function and we could start all over again. So those are the kind of things I think that we would want to expose, but official secrets and so forth, I think they should necessarily be hidden for so long, and clearly now they can't guarantee they are.
Just to surprise you, I don't want to harp on 1667, but who was the first witness that the committee sought information from? Admittedly, they did it via his official secretary, but they got heaps and heaps. Oh, it was the king. It's quite incredible. Yeah. So we shouldn't make assumptions.
You think so?
Stephen Main, could the panel muse on what would be the best tools to get more open government? FOI, you see the guerrilla warfare that Michael McKinnon from Channel 7 ran all the way to the High Court. Is it this technique with individual non-major party politicians bringing these sorts of actions for targeting specific documents? Or is it just a culture erasure from the major parties where the sort of the open government culture is promoted through direct legislation? So what would be the best tools if your overall goal is to foster a far more open system of government?
Yes, that's a question I can't answer.
The power to grow is still very strong. Very, very strong. And you just got to want to wield it. So one of the first things I ever had to vote on was and this is when I first started reading Greg's book, was a select committee to gaming licensing. And we hauled all sorts of people in there. Didn't get a member from the lower house, didn't get a former MP either, but we did get a lot of people and a lot of information. We had 2 inquiries, as I said, to Mikey, one into the Windsor decision, a specific planning decision made by a minister. Heaps of documents, motions, many of which, of course, have been granted quite successfully. and questions I notice. You just need very energetic politicians. This business of the government looking to, or the opposition looking to be in government fairly soon and vice versa, at the same time the government thinking they might be in opposition fairly soon and not wanting to set the bad precedents then either. Dina Tarley, our Green Senator, sought documents relating to the claim by the government in the Federal Senate that it was going to cost billions to make poker machines safer through $1 bets. I know it's something you're interested in, Steve. And the Labor and Liberal parties together did not support his motion, although routinely I think the Greens have supported all of the opposition's motions on things like the mining tax and so forth in a culture of openness. So at the end of the day, politics comes back to play, and that's why it's my job to push these things as hard as I can so that the opposition, tomorrow's government, and the government, tomorrow's opposition, isn't given space to just quietly sort of let all this stuff die down.
I think a large enough parliament to support an effective committee system is also really important. A parliament that is elected by proportional representation so that you have the prospect of nobody controlling the numbers in the House is important. Good freedom of information laws. Certainly there have been some changes at the federal level to FOI that seem to be making it more liberal. In fact, we've had the ridiculous situation where political decisions have been made to withhold information from Senate and Senate committees that officials have found no basis to withhold under FOI. So things that have been denied at a political level have been released because the administrative process is under the FOI. But all of these things, regular elections, an engaged electorate, people who want higher standards, they're all important.
More questions. Just following on from that, this is probably more of a statement, but this tension, I'm gathering from what you're saying, Greg Taylor, you've certainly given a strong indication of what this case might go, that in fact the Parliament of Victoria has, in your view, very, very strong powers to call for documents. I'm getting the impression that it's probably believed that the Commonwealth Parliament does as well. And the reason this does not happen, or the reason, Dr. Laing, you used a lot of language like they pulled back to the brink or pragmatism took over, that what goes around comes around, that oppositions don't want to push because they're too afraid that they are going to make embarrassing mistakes as well, that there's just the fear factor. The fear factor that they don't trust themselves not to do something bad or embarrassing, and therefore they don't want to set a precedent. Because in my view, if ever there was perhaps a time to call for documents, children overboard may well have been it. And for the opposition at that time, such a goal, such an absolute goal. But they didn't in the end try to kick it. Because they knew one day they would become the government, and so it's kind of this system. Maybe Greg Taylor, sorry, we've got too many Gregs on now, or sorry, I shouldn't have said that. We've got just enough. That your second and third points is the tension. It's simply held together by politics, and strangely enough, the politics of fear.
Yes, the will has to be there, of course, to use these mechanisms of accountability. As please can see, it is in the Legislative Council of Victoria, at least on the part of some members. That's what makes it so curious that when this document was first requested or demanded, Parliament doesn't request things, it tells you. When this document was first demanded, the government didn't bat an eyelid, and then suddenly this reply comes back. But yes, certainly the will has to be there. It must also be said, though, that unfortunately in these disputes, if the executive is willing to be obstructionist, then it can spin matters out. A parliament, of course, is a collective of people. It only meets so many days a year. It has many other things to do, and its procedures are rightly cumbersome. Then, of course, if there's a refusal, then you have to work out what your answer to that is, which might be nothing. In this case, the answer is to go to court and seek a declaration that the document is in fact one that can be demanded. That, of course, takes time to go to court. All the time the clock is ticking, because, of course, Parliament's only elected for 4 years. So it has unfortunately been the case in many circumstances, both in this country and overseas, that the executive has all the cards in its hand and Parliament has few. So the hope, I suppose, is that if the court rules in the way that I expect it will rule in this case, that a few of the cards will be shifted from the hands of the executive to the hands of the Parliament.
Okay, we've got one last question, and then we will.
Can I just add something on that? And that is that, you know, not every contested exercise of power ends up in a predictable end game, and that there are many ways to achieve your ends other than insisting on getting the document you asked for. For example, you can use a committee inquiry to ask questions around the issue, and we've found in the Senate that is a very effective way of getting to the bottom of things, or getting a lot more information than initially you expected. And one example of that was a few years ago there was a whole episode relating to pre-budget, an allegation that a minister had given advance warning pre-budget of new restrictions on MRI machines. Everyone rushed out and bought MRI machines. Well, the actual documents were withheld and refused, but the committee inquiry that was agreed to got to the bottom of it. There are other things you can do. You can be persuasive. You can say, well, you won't give us this NBN report? We don't consider your NBN legislation. You know, there are both subtle and non-subtle ways of addressing it. It's not black.
So obstructing the hands.
The politics of fear and blackmail.
But it's a pragmatism, yes. And using the procedural armour that a good set of standing orders provides.
That having been said, it would still be nice to have the final card in your hand. That's said.
The final card is there if the will is there to use it.
Indeed.
Okay, we might have time for just one more question. And we got somebody? Oh. I think I'm going to have to leave it to Omni to decide, because there's suddenly a lot of work there.
Just a short question.
Yeah.
Can you ever imagine a circumstance where a member of the government would be called to the bar of the upper house and for contempt, for example, the former Attorney General for the instructions he gave, as I understand it? You know, is that the brink? Is that past the brink? Can you ever see that happening in Australia in the modern day?
So Rosemary talked about punishments for contempt, whereas I always, I express it slightly different. If someone's obstructing the business of the House, including withholding information, then we use our coercive power so that they comply. But punishment per se, over the year afterwards, when it's too late, I don't think it's necessarily what I'm aiming for. But even that question, the difference between the ability to punish versus the ability to force compliance is also another disputed area that we could do a whole seminar on, if you like.
And it also depends what house this recalcitrant former minister is in. Because if they're in the other house, there's bugger all that the upper house can do because of the law of parliamentary privilege and the immunity of members of one house from being interfered with by the other house.
And
So,
a constitutional chicken that's
constitutional chicken, yeah. And I mean, that was what happened in the Egan and Willis case. The other house did punish the Treasurer Egan for failing to comply with the order of the documents. They suspended him, and the usher of the Black Rod marched him out onto the footpath on Macquarie Street. And he took the President of the Council and the usher to court, and it was in the course of those proceedings that the courts declared that the Council did have the power to order documents, cabinet documents. It did have the power to suspend one of its own members, but it didn't have the power because of its peculiar status of not having conferred House of Commons powers. It didn't have the power to inflict actual punishment that wasn't related to coercing the behaviour. So putting that on the footpath was a step too far. He won the footpath.
Which made it all worth it in more ways. Okay, did you have something to say? Look, I've been talking to him, but promises a short question.
Well, it's just a follow-up, and that was actually the same subject. And Rosemary's question for you. You were talking before about how the Attorney General wrote letters in the Senate that public servants weren't to answer questions. That's what happened in the Select Committee that I was a member of, the Select Committee to Public Land Development in the Upper House, where the Attorney wrote the direction that public servants shouldn't answer questions. Now, nothing was done about that. So my question is there a precedent, sort of like Greg was talking about, that parties have taken over and they don't do things because they might be the government next time. So is there a precedent of not doing something? Does that damage the power if it's not used?
Well, I think that's the logical conclusion. That's the logical conclusion, that when things fall into abeyance through non-use, people not only forget about them, but they make up myths about them. And there's my little story about the government leader in 1960 saying, oh, no, this is an obsolete procedure. You can't use this one. Assertion and amnesia are very bad enemies of parliamentary practice.
Okay, I think we do have to leave it there. First of all, let me echo the speakers in thanking you all for coming tonight, and especially on such a cold night. I must also personally thank the organisers of tonight's event, Omniuanu and Jay Tilley, who formerly of Greg Barber's office, so he wasn't able to be here tonight, and also from the Caston Centre, Janice Hugo. And if you could also please join me in thanking our three marvellous speakers.